Well, Russia's Vladimir Putin is visiting Iran today for high-stakes meetings with leaders from that country, as well as Turkey's president. They're expected to discuss major issues from weapons to the war in Syria and grain exports held up in Ukraine. So I want to bring in Michael O'Hanlon. He is here to give us some analysis. He's a senior fellow and director of research for the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institute, a nonprofit public policy research organization. And Michael specializes in defense strategy and U.S. foreign policy. So it's great to have you here. So on the surface, these sort of trilateral meetings, it's supposed to be about Syria, but we know that there are other issues that are probably higher on the agenda right now. What exactly is the purpose of Putin's meeting with Iran's president?
Greetings. Well, I think you covered some of them accurately. Certainly the idea of buying weapons could be on the agenda because Russia is taking a hit to a number of its key advanced technology systems. For example, drones that are used by both sides in this war, largely for targeting, sometimes for attacking. We know that Iran makes them, maybe not huge numbers, but Putin may be at the point where, because of the cutoff of high-tech technology to Russia that most countries have instituted since February 24th, he's not able perhaps to build those drones himself. So that's a distinct possibility. It's been widely reported. Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, alleged that, and my guess is there's probably some pretty good evidence behind that suspicion. And then, as you mentioned, there's the ongoing discussion about, is there a way to get Ukraine's grain into world markets and alleviate the mass starvation, or at least the mass hunger that's become so common because of that. And certainly Putin wants to be seen as trying to make an effort in that regard. Whether he'll actually decide to cooperate is another question. But more generally, I think he likes the idea of not being completely ostracized on the world stage, of showing the world that he still has some friends. No one's going to be that impressed that he has Iranian friends, but with a member of NATO, Prime Minister or President Erdogan from Turkey, showing up there as well and talking with Putin, keeps alive the idea that he's still a world leader with some standing, and perhaps keeps alive the possibility of resuming peace talks at some future date with Turkey, again, as intermediary. So those are, I think, some of the ideas that could be behind the visit.
So the Biden administration has said that Iran is going to provide Russia with these armed drones for use in the war in Ukraine. Clearly, that's going to be a point of conversation. Do you agree?
Yes. And for the reason I said before, that I think that Russia's probably lost a lot of its own drones in the fighting to date. We've provided the Ukrainians, as you know, with a lot of advanced technology systems. The Javelin got a lot of good press early in the war for shutting down the Russian tanks and vehicles that were trying to take Kyiv from the north. But I think the Stinger anti-aircraft missiles have been important for shooting down aircraft, for making it hard for Russia to establish air supremacy, and even for Russia to use drones effectively, since Stingers can be used against certain drones. So my guess is that there's a lot of attrition going on between the use of drones, the use of anti-drone technology, and Russia's running low. And this may be a technology domain where it's not able to do a very good job of producing drones on its own because of its dependence on foreign semiconductors, hence the lifeline that perhaps they're pursuing with Iran.
I think Turkey's role throughout this whole thing is quite fascinating to me. Yes, they have sort of a common interest when it comes to Syria, but Turkey and Russia are actually backing different sides when it comes to Syria. We'll put Syria to the side. Turkey and Erdogan has suddenly emerged, as you pointed out, as sort of the mediator when it comes to negotiations. Because they are a NATO member, they are able to say thumbs up or thumbs down about new NATO members. I'm just really curious about your take on Turkey's assertiveness in sort of injecting itself into this conflict.
Yeah, it's a great question, because we've seen this also with the Syrian civil war, where Russia and Turkey at one point came close to shooting at each other. In fact, I think Turkey shot down one Russian jet at one time, and they've backed opposite sides to some extent there as well. And yet they have some common interests. And I think Erdogan is in the business of playing complicated diplomacy and not reducing conflicts to sometimes the black and white, yes and no, good and bad terms that we tend to in the West. And I think Turkey, in a sense, is too exposed to Russia, to Syria, to Ukraine, to everything going around in the Black Sea. It's too exposed to just have the luxury of taking a moralistic position and sticking to that regardless of what may develop in the future. So I think people are keeping their options open. I don't know that there's any great grand strategy that Erdogan has in mind, but I think he wants to be involved in the conversation, not just for his prestige and his vanity, but also because I think he feels that's the best way to serve Turkey's own interests. So I would expect that to continue.
You know, my husband always says to me, in chaos, there's opportunity. And it just sort of feels a little bit like that is the strategy that Turkey is employing here. And particularly, you know, you talk about the negotiations to get some of the grain out. It just seems like Turkey might come out on top in the middle of all of this stuff, but we'll see.
Yeah, and speaking of the part of the world, the Middle East, I want to go back to the fallout from President Biden's trip to the Middle East, Michael. The Saudi kingdom has a very different account of President Biden's conversation about murdered Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Admiral John Kirby was asked about this on Red and Blue yesterday. I want to play a bit of what he had to say.
The president absolutely said what he told the American people he said about Jamal Khashoggi's killing and about his belief and who was responsible for that. The president stands by his account. The foreign minister of Saudi Arabia said he didn't hear it, and maybe he didn't. But that doesn't mean that President Biden didn't actually say it. And I would add, more critically, that the very first agenda item on the president's list when he sat down with the crown prince and other Saudi officials was Jamal Khashoggi.
So, what do you think the reason for this disconnect exists between these two countries?
Pride, the Saudi pride, that Mohammed bin Salman and his team not wanting to be criticized. And so on this one, I tend to support President Biden instinctively. I could be wrong, and I'm not necessarily even defending the trip. I think the trip was a judgment call that was a close call, and I'm not yet persuaded it was the right call. But I see no reason to think that President Biden would, deny this particular version of the truth. I think he's made it clear publicly many times how upset he is with the Saudis. And so I don't know why, he wouldn't have the inclination to say the same thing privately. On the other hand, you can't dwell on it. If you're going to bother to make a trip and try to accomplish some business, you can't just, if you're going to just scorn someone else or show contempt for them or show no interest in talking to them, then why make the trip in the first place? So it's not very realistic to think that Biden's going to travel all the way to Saudi Arabia and just be in a huff about, past events the entire trip. So I feel like we've sort of over-milked this issue for what it's worth. The question now is, to what extent do the Saudis actually help us with any future problems? And that's going to be really the only thing I care about going forward in assessing whether this trip by President Biden was worth it.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, certainly to be continued. Michael O'Hanlon, thank you very much as always. We appreciate the insight.
Thank you very much.